Hey kids, do you all know the story Make Way for Ducklings? I'm not sure, so I thought I'd read it. Um, this one here, check it out. This means it's good, or at least someone at some point thought it was good. And it's a famous story about ducks that fly to Boston to the duck pond in the park, which I bet you've been to. And you probably have even seen the little ducklings. There's a little statue now of them. But this is the book that that talks about them, that tells the story. So, thought this would be fun to read. It's a pretty old book, but I think this is why, if you're ever, down in Boston, you'll know some of the police officers wear puffy pants. I think it's because of this book, basically. It's an old-fashioned sort of police uniform, which you still see pretty much just in Boston and around here a little bit too. So, we'll start the book. Make Way for Ducklings by Robert McCloskey. Mr. and Mrs. Mallard were looking for a place to live. But every time Mr. Mallard saw what looked like a nice place, Mrs. Mallard said it was no good. There's sure to be foxes in the woods or turtles in the water, and she was not going to raise a family where there might be foxes or turtles. So they flew on and on. Here you go. This is a big picture. So you see Mr. and Mrs. Mallard. Mallards are ducks. And down here, places that are probably fine, but, foxes and turtles are a legitimate concern if you're a duck. When they got to Boston, they felt too tired to fly any further. There was a nice pond in the public garden with a little island on it. The very place to spend the night, quacked Mr. Mallard, so down they flapped. And here we go, right? This pond, this picture's kind of old, but the pond looks pretty much like that today. Here's the bridge right here, and this is where they stayed down here. And now, of course, over this way, you would find the statue of the ducks. Next morning, they fished for their breakfast in the mud at the bottom of the pond, but they didn't find much. Just as they were getting ready to start on their way, a strange, enormous bird came by. It was pushing a boat full of people, and there was a man sitting on its back. "Good morning," quacked Mr. Mallard, being polite. The big bird was too proud to answer, but the people on the boat threw peanuts into the water, so the Mallards followed them all around the pond and got another breakfast, better than the first. And there we go. Seen those boats, right? Right downtown in Boston. "I like this place," said Mrs. Mallard as they climbed out on the bank and waddled along. "Why don't we build a nest and raise our ducklings right in this pond? There are no foxes and no turtles, and the people feed us peanuts. What could be better?" "Good," said Mr. Mallard, delighted that at last Mrs. Mallard had found a place that suited her. But, traffic. Check that out. "Look out," squawked Mrs. Mallard, all of a dither. "You'll get run over." And when she caught her breath, she added, "This is no place for babies, with all these hard things rushing about. We'll have to look somewhere else." So they flew over Beacon Hill and round the State House. But there was no place there. They looked in Louisburg Square, but there was no water to swim in. It's not looking good. Then they flew over the Charles River. "This is better," quacked Mr. Mallard. "That island looks like a nice, quiet place, and it's only a little way from the public garden." "Yes," said Mrs. Mallard, remembering the peanuts. "That looks like just the right place to hatch ducklings." So here you go. There's the Charles River in Boston, right? It's much smaller out here in Natick, and then here is the island they're talking about. See that? Also still there. And you can go see it. At least I think it's there. It's not as interesting as the public garden. So they chose a cozy spot among the bushes near the water, and they settled down to build their nest. And only just in time, for now they were beginning to molt. All their old wing feathers started to drop out, and they would not be able to fly again until the new ones grew in. So here they are on their little island. See that? Right under the bridge, or next to the bridge, you know what I mean, below the bridge. There we go. They're getting cozy. But of course, even though their feathers were dropping out, they could still swim. And one day they swam over to the park on the riverbank, and there they met a policeman called Michael. Michael fed them peanuts. And after that, the mallards called him Michael every day. There's Michael. After Mr. Mallard had laid eggs in the nest, she couldn't go visit Michael anymore because she had to sit on the eggs to keep them warm. She moved off the nest only to get a drink of water, or to have her lunch, or to count the eggs to make sure that they were all there. Just a second, I need some tea. All this reading is hard work. But there she is counting her eggs. See that? One day, the ducklings hatched out. First came Jack, then Cack, then Lack, then Mack and Knack and Whack and Pack and Quack. Mr. and Mrs. Mallard were bursting with pride. It was a great responsibility taking care of so many ducklings, and it kept them very busy. There you go. Check them out. All with ack names. One day, Mr. Mallard decided he'd like to take a trip to see what the rest of the river was like, further on. So off he set. "I'll meet you in a week in the public garden," he quacked over his shoulder. "Take good care of the ducklings." "Don't you worry," said Mrs. Mallard. "I know all about bringing up children." And she did. She taught them how to swim and dive. She taught them to walk in a line and to come when they were called and to keep a safe distance from bikes and scooters and other things with wheels. There they are, practicing marching, basically. It's kind of cool. When at last she felt perfectly satisfied with them, she said one morning, "Come along, children, follow me." And before you could wink an eyelash, Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Whack, Pack, and Quack fell into line, just as they had been taught. Mrs. Mallard led the way into the water, and they swam behind her to the opposite bank. And there, they waded ashore and waddled along until they came to the highway. Here they are, heading toward the road. Oh my gosh. Look at those old-fashioned cars. It's kind of cool. There you go. Mrs. Mallard stepped out to cross the road. Honk, honk went the horns on the speeding cars. Quack went Mrs. Mallard as she tumbled back again. Quack, 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 quack went Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Whack, Pack, and Quack, just as long as their little quackers could quack. The cars kept speeding by and honking, and Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings kept right on quack, quack, quacking. Oh, she is so mad. Yeah. I don't think that people would normally stop for ducks. They made such a noise that Michael, remember Michael, the police officer? Michael came running, waving his arms and blowing his whistle. There's Michael, booking it toward the road. He planted himself in the center of the road, raised one hand to stop the traffic, and then beckoned with the other, the way policemen do, for Mrs. Mallard to cross over. There we go. All better, at least this point. As soon as Mrs. Mallard and the Ducklings were safe on the other side and on their way down Mount Vernon Street, Michael rushed back to his police booth. He called Clancy at headquarters and said, "There's a family of ducks walking down the street." Clancy said, "Family of what?" "Ducks," yelled Michael. "Send a police car, quick." There he is on the phone. Confusing, I'm sure, Clancy at the office. Meanwhile, Mrs. Mallard had reached the corner bookshop and turned onto Charles Street, with Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Whack, Pack, and Quack all marching in a line behind her. See that? They're all down the bottom, and people are watching. Everyone stared. An old lady from Beacon Hill said, "Isn't it amazing?" And the man who swept the street said, "Well, now, ain't that nice?" And when Mrs. Mallard heard them, she was so proud she tipped her nose in the air and walked along with an extra swing in her waddle. And when they came to the corner of Beacon Street, there was the police car with 4 policemen that Clancy had sent from headquarters. The policemen held back the traffic so Mrs. Mallard and the Ducklings could march across the street. This is my favorite picture. Check that out. See the police officers? You see the Ducklings? They're way over here. It's a little hard to see, but there they are, going straight across into Public Garden. Right into, this is what it says now, right into the Public Garden. Check it out. Looks familiar, right? Inside the gate, they all turned around to say thank you to the policemen. And the policemen smiled and waved goodbye. There they are. Thank you, police officers. When they reached the pond and swam across to the little island, there was Mr. Mallard waiting for them, just as he had promised. You see Mr. Mallard? He's on the island. He's just a little duck, though. The Ducklings liked the new island so much that they decided to live there all day long. And all day long, they follow the swan boats and eat peanuts. And then when night falls, they swim to their little island and they go to sleep. That's nighttime. Well, hey, thanks for listening to the story. And, we'll see each other again soon in person at some point. And until then, just remember that, we're looking forward to seeing you when we get back in church, and that we all love you and miss you. Hang in there. Bye.